We are starting a new series this morning. As Trevor mentioned, we just came off of 5 weeks of conversations. I really enjoyed them. From the feedback we heard from a lot of you guys did as well. It was such a rich time to learn. Thanks to Michael and Jason and Anne and Helen for coming on, for Patrick joining. A lot of the conversations we had, I certainly learned a ton from, and so just thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing the feed with other people. We received all sorts of feedback from people outside of the church, outside of faith. It was so positive, and so really enjoyed those. It actually inspired us to launch our own podcast. And so something we're really excited about, we are starting filming this week. And my first guest is probably my favorite person in the world, my wife. And so Josie is going to be joining me for podcast number 1. We're going to be talking about marriage, so thrilled about that. From there on, we got a lineup dealing with family, dealing with some poverty stuff. So we got a good lineup of conversations that, again, are going to go along the same type of idea as the quarantine conversations did. We really think we need to have more conversations. I cannot say it enough. It'll be a part of the conversation today, the sermon today. This idea that we need to dialogue, we need to allow ourselves to process, to think through. And what we're seeing from a lot of even the professional journalism is not actually really good conversation. It's more politically driven in many ways, trying to spin a point. And we want to have conversations for Southwestern Ontario, where we live here, having real conversations about what this looks like on the ground. And so really looking forward to that. And so keep your eyes open. This morning we are launching a series called The Great Journey. And there's a couple things that really drew me, I guess, and the team to deciding this series. One of it was this reality that whenever we face a crisis, we begin to question a lot of things. The first time I think I really noticed this would have been 9/11, and a lot of that's just because I was in my I'm 19, I think 18, 19 years old, so I'm old enough to begin to see some of this stuff, but really in a world where we didn't talk a whole lot about faith, because that's not what Canadians do. We don't talk about faith or politics. Those are things we don't discuss. All of a sudden there was a whole lot of conversation, and there was a bunch of people that flooded to the church, but then there was a bunch who flooded out of the church. And so you've seen across North America and really around the world, people starting to ask some questions about, well, if God is real, why would he allow this to happen, all that kind of stuff. And so this became this bit of a faith crisis in the midst of all the other stuff that was going on. But I've seen it now so much during this pandemic that people begin, as this crisis hits, they begin to question things that they thought they knew. If God is so good, why is he allowing this? If God is so strong, is he going to carry us through this pandemic? If God is so big, is he bigger than the conspiracy? And if the conspiracy is real, if God is really as good as he claims he is, he's going to allow us to go through that. And all these other endless questions. And crises have a way of doing that. They force us to those moments. And I think they're good. But it doesn't have to just be these massive crises. It can also be something as simple as a diagnosis. Not a Canada-wide thing, but just a friend. A friend got diagnosed with something, or a buddy, or a death of somebody that you love. And it begins to challenge what you believe. What do I believe about these things? And so on the one hand, there was this idea that we were going through a crisis, and I really felt like we aren't talking enough about why we believe what we believe. Because every time we face a crisis, it seems to shake the foundations that we have, whether you're in the church or out of the church. And the second thing is something that we've talked about multiple times over the last 10 years. It was a Hemorrhaging Faith report that came out about 10 years ago. And basically a bunch of the larger denominations, I think youth leaders, I don't exactly know who's all involved, but they commissioned a report asking the question about youth in the church and whether they were still staying in the church, whether they were leaving the church, and if they were leaving the church, then why they were leaving the church. And so it was a thing studying church culture, and really there was this trend where there was a lot of young adults leaving the church, and we were trying to understand why. And so a couple of things that came from that report, some of the highlights. 1 in 3 Canadian young adults who attended church weekly as a child still does so today. And so again, this is 10 years ago, and so I would be actually curious when I read all 3 of these key synopsis pieces, what those same people would say in 10 years, because one of the issues with some of these studies, as much value as there was in this, is that as we go through different points in our life, we answer these questions very differently. Especially when you're dealing with youth and young adults, that's the stage where we really begin to rebel, and not necessarily in a bad way, but you're forming your own identity. And as you get into those later teens and sometimes earlier teens, but you're no longer, it's not good enough just to believe what mom and dad believe. Now you need to make that decision about what you believe. And so some of that, we rebel and we try different things. And if you grew up in the church, now all of a sudden you're in university and you're being challenged. And so there's all sorts of reasons for this. And so I'd actually be really curious if you could go back and 10 years later. But right then what they had found was that 1 in 3 kids who grew up in the church still did so then. The second thing was, of the young adults who no longer attend church, half of them have stopped identifying themselves as Christians. And so of those, about a third of the people who grew up in church were now saying they're not even Christians anymore. And they were looking at the reasons why. Why would you leave? Because when you think about the question about whatever faith you have, whether you don't have a faith and you're an atheist, or whether you're agnostic, or whether you're Buddhist, or whatever faith you have, what would it take to leave that faith? And so they were looking at these questions with the young adults, and they came up with 4 key things. I think there's more, but 4 of the big ones. They saw a lot of hypocrisy in the church. They felt it was a ton of judgment in the church. They felt it was very exclusive, and they just saw a lot of failure. And so those are the 4 reasons that they gave, and they said this is why young adults are leaving the church. And we've talked about this a lot. If you go back, even a series we did a couple months ago, we talked about a lot of the shortcomings of the church and a lot of the shortcomings of Christians, and how we still believe in a church, and how I still believe in God despite the fact that the church often fails and I often fail. That we aren't this perfect group, that we aren't on a pedestal. And I think it's important to keep having those conversations, because for us as a church, and I hope for those of you guys listening, vulnerability is something that we want to begin really to model. We want to be real. I don't want to be fake. I want to be open, and I want to be honest, and that's how you create real community. But I think there's one other thing in here, as I was thinking through that really struck me. And I think this is kind of where we drive this series from, and that's the question of, so when was the last time you actually thought about why you believe what you believe? And I was thinking about the youth, in my experience in youth, coming through a church, and I grew up in the church, I spent my whole life in the church. When you're going through those youth years, do you ever take the time to really consider why you believe what you believe? But not just that, but adults. When was the last time that you actually looked down, spent some time and seriously studied, what do you actually believe? Because my conviction, or what I've seen a lot of in my time here at the church, and in my time just working with people in general, is that a lot of times they're actually not that sure what they believe, and that's why when they get put in a position where somebody begins to challenge it, they begin to falter. And so I think one of the issues that we have as a church is that the fact that now, with an abundance of knowledge that's out there, you can find anything you want online. And so if you grow up in the church and you never challenge and are never convinced and never research what you actually believe, now all of a sudden you go to university and somebody says, well, the Bible's not real, and here's the reasons why. And then you go online, you research that, and you go, oh shoot, there's a ton of articles about that. Maybe the Bible isn't real. And whatever you want to find online now, with our incredible amount of knowledge that we have available to us, you can find. And so if you want documents that say the Bible is real, you can find that. If you want documents that say it isn't, you find it. If you want to find documents that say Jesus lived, you find them. If you want to say documents that Jesus wasn't alive, you can find those. You can find all that. And so what happens to a lot of people is that they're fine. As long as you have people surrounding you who believe the exact same thing you do, it's fine. And then you all of a sudden begin to get challenged. And some of that may be through a crisis, but some of that may just be through intellectual prodding. And somebody says, hey, what about this? Or why did God allow this? Now all of a sudden your faith begins to crumble. And I think one of the big issues in our culture, and again, this goes back to conversations, is the fact that we don't talk about this enough. I don't know why we have this mentality. To me, it makes no sense. We say, well, we're not going to talk about politics. We're not going to talk about religion. And when you look right now, those two conversations, if they would have been happening for a good, healthy way in the last 10 years, I don't know if we'd be in the mess we're in right now. A lot of the reason we have the lockdowns are because the governments haven't done their jobs. If our hospitals were running efficiently, if our public health organizations were equipped, we wouldn't be in this mess. But we are. But we don't want to talk about it. Well, let's not talk about politics, because we don't actually know how to deal with the fact that people are going to disagree with us. And it's the same thing with religion. I believe what I believe, you believe what you believe, and it doesn't matter. But it does matter. It matters so much. But we don't have those conversations. And so for people growing up in faith, for people growing up outside of faith, a lot of what we actually believe, we've just blindly followed. often what we've believed we've done on emotions. And we had an experience. I had a bad experience with a Christian, and so then Christianity must be fake. It's really interesting. Jeff Allen is a comedian I listen to. I love listening to comedians. We do a lot of dry bar comedy, which if you guys don't know, it's great access to good, clean comedy, but really hilarious. So Jeff Allen, anyway, is one of the guys that I discovered on there, and he talks about his story. And so he is a Christian now, but he talks about beforehand, and just fascinating. And it's not so much with Jeff that I'm interested, it's his friend. So if you hear this story, he talks about a buddy of his coming up to him and challenging him. He just, did you believe in God? And I don't remember verbatim the way this conversation went, but do you believe in God? And Jeff's like, no, I'm an atheist. And so his friend goes, okay, well, no, that's cool. But what drew you to that conclusion? Did you study? Did you come to the conclusion the Bible wasn't real and all the other religions were fake, and you really researched it and you concluded at the end of everything that you've studied that God could not be real? And Jeff's like, no, I've never really looked into it. I just don't think he exists. And so his friend had some harsh words for him, but basically said, you're ridiculous. Like, how do you come to a conclusion like that without doing any research? And I think that's really at the crux of what we're going to talk about leading up to Easter here is we're going to go to this moment where we believe Jesus died on the cross. But long before we get there, we need to ask ourselves, what do we actually believe? And why do I believe that? If you grew up in the church, especially if you're a teen and young adult, why do you believe what you believe? How did you come to the conclusion that God was real? How did you come to the conclusion that Jesus was here? And based on what evidence are you now committing your life to this belief? You need to know those answers. Jesus speaks about that. He says it this way in the end of Matthew 7. He says, therefore everybody who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. The rains came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against the house. Yet it did not fall, because it had a foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against his house, and it fell with a great crash. Storms reveal our foundations. One of the cool things that happened for us a couple years ago, it was probably 10 years ago already now, we took our youth down to New Orleans to do a project with Mennonite Disaster Services. And so what they do is they go to places where there's been a natural disaster or disaster of some other sorts, and for people who cannot afford to rebuild or didn't have insurance or for whatever reason, and so they try to find housing. And so we were building a house, and it was an area that was decimated by a hurricane, and so they have designed these houses to withstand hurricanes. And so we were a part of that. And so whatever, fast forward to this past year, one of the leaders who went with us, I believe it was Lanita, she shared a link with us that this house was still standing. And they had just experienced another hurricane, but the way the foundation had been built, it was just a really cool piece that we could be a part of. We were a part of building that house, and the hurricane had come and it just stood. But it's all about the foundation. And what Jesus talks about is, he says, look, you need that strong foundation. Because when the storms come, which they will, it's going to be a foundation that either helps you stay or you're going to collapse. And one of the things I want to get in here that I think is really fascinating is we're going to be talking about beliefs a lot, but there's a significant difference between belief and conviction. Hear me out on this. As nouns, so my wife should, as an English teacher, should be really proud of me. As nouns, which, full disclosure, I read this online. I have no idea what a noun is. I am not an English major. But as nouns, for those of you that do, the difference between belief and conviction is that belief is a mental acceptance of a claim as truth, regardless of supporting or contrary empirical evidence, while conviction is a firmly held belief. And so the way we're going to use these words, we're going to use this definition. Belief is something that you can come to that really hasn't been tested. And so really when we're going to look back at what Jesus said here, but belief is hearing his words, but not building it on the right foundation. Belief is believing anything you want to believe, but just not allowing it to be tested. Right? This is what's happening with a lot of social media posts. People say all sorts of stuff, but it doesn't actually go through the testing process. They just say it and walk away. A belief is something that you can, like for instance, we could believe, hypothetically, that the Maple Leafs are going to win the Stanley Cup. We could believe that. We have that option to believe that, but has that been tested? No. It has for the last 60 years, right? But a belief is something that you can just believe, and it doesn't matter what the empirical data says, it doesn't matter what anything else says, you can just believe it. But then a conviction is something that has gone through the ringer, that has gone through the testing, that has gone through the fire, and it is something that you deeply hold to. See, it's those convictions that we want to talk about. What are the things that, no matter what the storm, you are convinced? So for people of faith, we say God is in control. Well, then why are we buying into all these conspiracy theories? For people of faith, we say God is loving and he cares and he has a good plan. Then why are we rebelling against that plan and choosing our own way? For people of faith, if being a follower of Jesus is about laying your life down to the plan of God, which for Jesus meant death, why are we hoarding our life and trying to cling to it? What are you actually convicted about at its core about faith? Not what do you believe, but what are the things that you are convinced are true? And no matter what happens, that I will cling to. And that's what I want to talk about this series. I want to talk about those convictions. And what I want to challenge you guys to do is to just lower your defenses. Because part of the reason why we don't have discussions about politics and religion is the fact that we cannot handle anyone arguing with us, because one of our fears is that we're wrong. But I want to challenge you guys as families, as individuals, to just lower your defenses and just go, well, why do I believe what I believe? Why do I show up to church? Or why don't I go to church? Why do I believe there's a God? Why don't I believe there's a God? And begin to ask some of those questions. Because I think the journey of finding that is one that, when we actually journey through it and we have deep convictions about this, is going to bring you a ton of freedom, a ton of purpose, and a ton of joy. But what I didn't want to do with this series is I did not want it to just be a pie-in-the-sky, loosely framed, philosophical debate about big questions. I wanted it to actually have rubber on the road. I wanted it to actually, we want to talk about why do we care about these convictions? What difference does it make? Is it just about whether you go to church or not? These convictions have massive implications on every part of our lives. So I want to start with this one. Everybody, I would argue, I would believe that most people in Canada, at least, if not all, would say that everyone should be able to sleep indoors. You should be able to at least have a warm bed. Canada has a lot of cold winters. It's freezing cold. Nobody should have to be homeless. And you can believe that and do nothing with it. But the difference between a belief and a conviction is what I've seen in Elmer. So this past week I posted about that on social media, and I just put a big shout out to a bunch of people. But what the difference between a belief and a conviction is, a belief says, yeah, they should have housing. A conviction says, I'm going to do something about it to make sure that they get housing. Because I have a deep conviction that their life matters. I have a deep conviction that they should have housing. And if that costs me, that's okay. I'm going to do something. And what I've seen in Elmer with the homeless shelter is amazing, because it's not just a place where people say, okay, well, we're going to open up a place, you come in and sleep, and in the morning we're going to give you the boot, and then you come back again tonight. It is that, but it's so much more. I've watched people advocate tirelessly, not just to give them a place to sleep, but also to find them a place to permanently stay. And when you talk to Paul Cowley or Sean Doyle, you very quickly realize that they have a deep-rooted conviction that these people deserve dignity, they deserve love, and they want to be a part of that solution. This isn't just about a belief that everyone should have housing. This is about a conviction that every human should be able to sleep indoors, if they so want. But the second thing I want to lead this into is another example is, I want to talk about Harry and Susanna Cowan. And the reason I want to talk about Harry and Susanna is, there's a lot of debate. Every time there's an election. This was big in the U.S. and it'll be big in Canada again. And in churches and in non-churches, they fight about this all the time, but there's this pro-life versus pro-choice movement. And so there's all these debates and what choice we should make. And so on the belief standpoint, there's a lot of people who believe that they're pro-life and they believe that they're pro-choice. But then there's some people like Harry and Susanna who they don't just believe that they're pro-life, they actually have a conviction about it. See, the difference between that is a lot of people are pro-birth. I always hate the term pro-life because a lot of people who are pro-life are actually just pro-birth. They don't want to do anything with the kid when they're born. But to be truly pro-life and to have a conviction about this, that's what Harry and Susanna have. And so Harry and Susanna, if you guys had the privilege of getting to know them and getting underneath all the jokes and the funny times when you're together and actually hearing their heart, from the first time I met them to the day they left, their heart was for kids. And specifically kids who had lost their parents. And they said right away when they came here, and they've been all over from Belgium to Africa and all these places, and so their history sets them up well for where they're at right now. But their conviction was that every child deserved a loving parent. But it wasn't just a belief. It was a deep-rooted, deeply felt conviction. And so when this opportunity opened up to serve at an orphanage in Africa, in Kenya to be specific, and the link is, Patrick is going to put the link in there for us. When it came up, it wasn't even a question. And so they worked tirelessly out here to earn the funds to go out there. They worked and worked and worked. They didn't just ask everybody to give because their conviction was that they wanted to go. And so now they're there. And they are serving, and they're finding out that the needs are actually significantly greater than they expected. And so this isn't a plug for money, but if that is something you were drawn towards, they could certainly use it. A lot of the buildings there are in disrepair. They have a significant shortage of food and proper nutrition for these kids. But their conviction was that every child deserved to have love and meaning and hope. See, that's the difference between a belief and a conviction. Now, not every one of you guys watching need to go volunteer at the homeless shelter. And not every one of you is watching need to go serve at an orphanage. But when it comes to dealing with the vulnerable in our community, every one of you are necessary. So what we want to do during this series is not just to talk about concepts. I want to begin to challenge your convictions. What is your conviction about the less, those who have not enough in our culture? Those who are poor, those who are homeless, the vulnerable, the orphan. What is your conviction? And what part of the solution are you playing? Because a lot of you guys have so many different ways you're helping out, whether that's loving for your neighbors, whether that's taking care of your parents, and whether that's whatever that looks like. So this isn't about saying, you need to do more. It's about just saying, well, just stop. Let's just think about this. What is my conviction? And then where do I go from there? See, these convictions, it's not just philosophies. What you believe about God literally changes everything. And so for those of you guys who are followers of Christ, you guys know the answers to these questions already because Scripture gives them. But a belief is different than a conviction. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And so I want to challenge you guys. We're going to watch this video. So I asked Harry to just send me a video of what they're doing. And so it's not a dramatic video showing poor kids. It's just literally where they're at. And it's actually quite beautiful. Africa is an incredibly beautiful land. But we're going to show you this video. And what I want you to do during that time, I want you to just let some of this stuff that I've been saying just kind of begin to bounce around in your brain. What is my conviction about this? How do I become a part of the solution? And what part do I play? And this isn't just about adults, it's about kids. Kids, what's your heart for the homeless? What's your heart for the for foster kids, for orphans? What's your heart for them? So with that, let's play this video, and then I will come back and I will close this off in prayer.
pizza, like what type of pizza is gonna be?
It's gonna be blue pizza.
Blue pizza.
Got it!
Hey, thanks, Harry and Susanna, for sending that our way. Thanks for the work you guys are doing out there. As we begin this journey, and we begin leading up to Easter, my hope really is that we can really engage in some really good, honest questions. There are a lot of questions that humans have, and there's a lot of questions about where did everything come from? Why am I here? And those are questions that we want to touch on. We want to look at. We want to look at what we see in the life of Jesus to give us some clue about why we're here and what our purpose is. And so with that, my hope is that you guys spend the next week beginning to think on what you believe, and then we'll dive further into the next part next Sunday. So with that, I am going to close in prayer. I hope you guys have an amazing week. We'll talk to you guys soon. Father God, thank you so much for this amazing morning, for this community, that although we cannot be in person, we certainly sense the fact that we are able to be together. Thank you, God, for this technology. God, I thank you for everyone that's listening. God, it has been trying times, and I'm grateful for all the amazing people that we are surrounded with, the amazing people that in this community that you've allowed us to be a part of. And so as we go into this week, Father, I pray that you'll guide the government as they make their decisions on what to open. I pray that you'll be with us as leaders in our churches and our communities. I pray for all the other churches in our region. Give us wisdom to know how to respond. Be with the school teachers. Be with everybody who is back and open. And yeah, God, I just pray you'll continue to guide us to give people energy, to equip us for the call that you've placed in our lives. And specifically for Harry and Susanna, God, I pray that you will give them the resources they need. Give them the energy they need to keep loving, and may their lives inspire us to live out our convictions. And Father God, we love you. Amen.